As you open the creaking door of the proving grounds of the Mad Overlord, the first thing that hits you is the stagnant and somehow rotting air that fills your nostrils. As you look into the darkness, you wonder what horrors could possibly await in the caverns ahead. Hello everyone, my name is Rosin, and welcome to Talking Tabletop, a new series that I've actually wanted to make for quite a while now, where I can just discuss my thoughts and opinions on tabletop role-playing games, which is something that I don't want to say I got into fairly late. I was about to say that, but the more I think about it, I feel like I kind of got on board with this hobby at a pretty popular time, which was around 2014, maybe 2015, depending on how you really want to slice it. Which I feel like is the case for a lot of people who kind of joined in on that mid-2010s boom that especially happened with stuff like 5th edition and Critical Role and all that, though my experience getting into it was slightly different, and this is going to be the video where I talk about my history getting into it and kind of where I'm at with it nowadays. So, definitely... this is going to be a series where I am not worried too much about whatever the footage is. This right here is me playing Wizardry Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord. This is actually the PlayStation 1 version, which very, very influenced by tabletop role-playing games, so I thought it'd be appropriate. And I'm going to make a longer-form Wizardry 1 review at some point, hopefully in this month or the next, depending on how my schedule works out. But I thought it'd be appropriate for... this series, talking about my history with it, to play a game that is kind of a classic in that regard. And yeah, just in general, the footage you'll be seeing for these videos is just going to be whatever RPG I happen to be playing at the time, or whatever I feel is thematically appropriate. Like, you know, if I'm talking about sci-fi stuff, maybe I'll throw a sci-fi game, or sci-fi game footage up here, or whatever, but I'm not going to stress too much about that. You know what, maybe this series might be the excuse I need to actually sit down and fucking finish Baldur's Gate, which is something I've needed to do forever now. I was laughing at myself the other day because I was going through my Switch apps, and I actually just deleted it, because I had to be honest with myself, and I was like, I'm probably not going to go back through and get around to that Switch Baldur's Gate save file I created, just because, I don't know, it didn't feel right on the Switch. It was a useful way to play that game, I guess, but something about Baldur's Gate just doesn't feel right with the controller. Like, I feel like that's a game you really need to play on PC. It just felt off to me as someone who's played CRPGs before. So, yeah, Baldur's Gate is definitely the RPG I think I have started and restarted the most in my life, so this might be the excuse I need to just finally sit down, make a character, and just deal with the archaic bullshit and just go through and fucking play to completion, because there's just no excuse at this point. And, you know, I've played Planescape Torment in my time, and Pillars of Eternity. If I can do that, I can weasel my way through Baldur's Gate 1 for sure. So, but enough about that. This is not a series about my commitment issues to old school RPGs. This is a video about how I got into tabletop role-playing games, and actually the times I didn't get into tabletop role-playing games is what we're going to talk about in the early phase of this video here. Because there were a few times where I was exposed to the hobby and I just bounced off, and for a while there I really thought that it just wasn't something for me. So let's go ahead and just start at the very beginning. I was thinking about this going into this video and making my little loose bullet point list of what got me into the hobby, and I honestly think what might have been my earliest exposure to the concept of tabletop role-playing games might have been Dexter's Lab, the old cartoon, because if I recall, there is an episode that was kind of like I don't remember if it was about D&D, but there was definitely, like, they were playing D&D, or, like, you know, whatever, a fantasy role-playing game, you know, for copyright-safe reasons or whatever, at a table, and I, you know, being a kid, I was like, oh, this seems like a weird board game. You have all these, like, little dividers up, and I'm not sure what's going on here. And I think that might have been my first exposure to the concept of, like, hey, there are these games that people play where they play roles, and it's a little more in-depth than what you expect from, like, a board game that a kid would be used to, that sort of thing. I don't want to say more in-depth than a board game, because God knows there are plenty of complex and mechanically intricate board games out there, and, you know, some of them with very interesting narrative hooks, you know. It is not a inferior version of tabletop RPGs, as I feel like sometimes TRPG fans are a little gung-ho about saying. You know, they're two very, very closely related mediums that share much in common. But I think that was probably the first time I was really exposed to it. Then, when I was I want to say I was in middle school. This might have been my... I want to say I was 13. It was about 7th grade. I was over at a friend's house one time, and this was a friend I didn't hang out too often with. And we kind of ended up hanging out with different people when we went into high school. He kind of fell out of our group of friends, not for any, like, real particular reason. It's just that there was people who were doing stuff that he was more interested in, so, like, we kind of drifted apart. We ended up going to college together, and, like, we had a really good conversation where it was just like, oh, hey, good to see you, and all that or whatever. But this was a guy who was around for, like, my middle school part of life, and then just I never really talked to or hung out with all that much after. But I hung out with him a couple times, just me and him that year, outside of our group of friends. And I would say we were probably on the nerdier side of things in that particular friend group. And he introduced me to Dungeons & Dragons, what would have been 3.5 at the time, I am fairly certain. And he had bought it, and it was very clear he didn't really have too many people to play it with. I think he referenced that his cousins got him into it or something, but, like, you know, they lived far away and he couldn't see them all that often. So he was like, oh, do you want to play? And then I can run you through. Usually you're supposed to do it with, like, a group of people, but, I mean, it's just the two of us or whatever, and we're not going to find other people to play with us. And I was like, yeah, sure, fine, whatever. And he had plotted out this very basic dungeon crawl with all of these, like, these pre-bought maps and stuff or whatever. They looked pretty cool, from what I remember. But he gave me, like, a pre-made, like, knight character to, it was just a fighter or something to play as. And I don't really remember the basics of the adventure all that much. But I remember thinking, like, wow, this is interesting. But the way that it was run, it was very obviously a very linear, planned, like, very simple dungeon crawler that someone who was 13 would come up with or whatever. So it wasn't, like, mind-blowing to me, like a lot of people have when they first play a game like this, where they realize the level of roleplay that you can achieve, or the mechanical interesting things that you can get up to with the system when you really start to get into it. It just really did feel like a fun little board game that had more of a story bent to it, which mimicked the fantasy stuff that we were into at the time, like, the Lord of the Rings movies and Final Fantasy. Me and him were both, I wouldn't say really into Fire Emblem. He more so than I. I was a casual Fire Emblem fan at that point, and I still, honestly, to this day, still consider myself a casual Fire Emblem fan. I need to play Three Houses one of these days. That'd be another good thing to put in the background of one of these videos, I suppose. So that was neat. The one thing I do remember from that, though, is that a month later, another friend, and I were all hanging out at his place again, and he ran us through the adventure again, using, again, pre-made characters. I played the exact same character as I did the last time, and it took me a little bit for me to realize that this was supposed to be the same adventure, and my character wasn't supposed to remember what had happened last time. And he had to pull me aside and be like, you're gonna ruin this for our other friend if you keep spoiling things. And I was like, oh, I thought this was like a sequel. I didn't realize we were rebooting this and adding a new adventurer. Whoops, sorry about that. That was embarrassing. I remember that. That was funny. I didn't really get it, I suppose, for what he was talking about. And, a very good example of why Session Zero and setting expectations is very important to role-playing games. Sometimes you think something's a sequel when it's not. Very specific problem, but I bet it's happened to other people in this hobby. Goodness. So we ran through it this time. I believe my other friend was playing as, like, an elven wizard or something. And, yeah, we ran through it again, and it was cool. Didn't really give it any thought after that, though. I was just like, oh, that was a fun thing to do with friends or whatever, but every other time we hung out after that, we would just, like, play video games or, hang out somewhere or something. We never really revisited it. I don't really particularly know why. I don't know if he felt like maybe it was something that was harder to run than he, because I remember it was a little clumsy. Just, he had to stop and look at the book a lot, which, you know, a lot of new GMs need to do that, or groups need to do that in general. So I don't know if maybe he got a little flustered by that, or what exactly happened there. Or maybe he just didn't think that we were taking it seriously enough. That could have been the case. We were dumb kids. I really don't remember. This is well over a decade ago at this point, so I just do not, honestly, yeah, like, decade and a half, like, just do not remember, so. Yeah, that was my first real exposure to it. There were a few other times where I had kind of thought about, like, getting into it the more that, I grew into my teen years and was kind of more into the, I got more invested in, like, internet communities and stuff, and, you know, every now and again I'd see people talking about tabletop RPGs, and I'd be like, hey, these seem pretty cool. But I never really gave them much of a go. And I think one thing that didn't help is, more so my younger years, like even before that D&D 3.5e experience, is that I definitely grew up in a Catholic household or whatever, with folks that definitely bought into the, like, oh, like, D&D is involved with weird satanic stuff or whatever, and, you know, all that nonsense that got peddled around, or even, like, I think, honestly, it was less the satanic stuff and more just, like, it was a weird subculture that seemed a little subversive and full of eccentric people. Less so the Satan thing, though that was definitely part of it, I would say. Fortunately, they cooled on that as I got older and, you know, was more of a independent person who could make my own decisions on things. Like, I'm sure if I would have told them at 13, oh yeah, I played D&D 3.5e, they first of all, they wouldn't know what the fuck 3.5e meant, but second of all, they probably wouldn't have cared. But yeah, the next experience I had wouldn't come until, I believe it was freshman year of university. I got invited by my ex's friend group to take part along with her in a game of D&D 4th edition. I don't remember if... I don't think 5th edition was out at this point. I'm going to need to look this up. It might have been in playtest, because I know it was in that for a while. I'm Googling it frantically right now. Oh yeah, it was absolutely not out at this time. Would have been, like, right before. So, yeah, it was a game of 4th edition that, again, I was given a pre-made character who was and you're gonna have to bear with me, I'm not super familiar with 4th edition stuff. I want to say it was a Dwarven Psionic, if that's even a real class. It was a dwarf with psychic powers. And I can't even remember what my ex played, to be completely honest with you. But we were invited over by one of her friends, which was a group of people who I had never really engaged with or interacted with outside of this one night. But we went into her friend's basement. And actually, I believe it wasn't even her friend's basement. I believe it was her friend's neighbor or something. I don't know. But the only thing I knew is I accepted an invite to hang out with people. I was in this person's basement who I didn't know. And he had this huge TV that he had Fantasy Grounds or Roll20 or some virtual tabletop on. Really impressive setup. Really fancy... honestly, really fancy couches that had, like, the little, like, bend-out arms or whatever. We all had, like, bowls and snacks or whatever. It was a really good time. It was actually very comfy. Looking back on it now, fond memories of that dude's setup. Very jealous. It just seemed like a cozy time to be able to have, like, a fun night playing D&D, but without, like, physical stuff, like doing it on a... couch looking at a TV or whatever. It was just a good time. And actually, it wasn't even all of us in the same room. I believe that there was there's 4 of us in person, including the GM. And then 2 players who were calling in from different states to play as well, and we were all just playing on this virtual tabletop. And we weren't even directly controlling our characters. We were all just kind of dictating what our character was doing or where they were moving. And the GM was moving all of the tokens for us. I barely remember what exactly happened. What I do remember is that I got to do a really cool thing very early on, which definitely left a bigger impression on me than anything involving that experience with 3.5e I had as a 13-year-old, where, like, there was a group of something chasing us. I don't remember what, but I used my psychic abilities to, like, destroy a bridge over, like, a huge, like, canyon or something, and, like, they all fell in, and I was like, you know, I got to pop in with a really cool heroic moment, which was neat. And then I remember we traveled a little bit further than that and got into a, like, mysterious town where, like, shady things were happening with, like there was, like, a Flying Dutchman ship type thing going on with, like, spectral pirates that were coming in and, like, invading the town and stealing their supplies or something that the GM was definitely seeding for, like, a next session. But what I really remember from the session, and really, frankly, what kind of almost alienated me from the hobby, and I guess slight content warning, I guess, for just talking about dudes being creepy about sex stuff. One of the people calling in was a guy playing a rogue who got, like, really, really invested in, like, finding, like, I think he kept calling them, like, tavern wenches or so, or, like, he kept, like, going around the town trying to look for, like, sex workers or whatever, and, like, interrupting people to do so, or just, like, be really not normal about, like, making sure everyone knew that his character fucked and was very good looking, and it was just really fucking weird. And that kind of left a bad taste in my mouth, and I remember my my ex was not too impressed either, so we did not come back for the next session, and we just let that group continue playing on their own, but we were both like, yeah, let's not do that again, because that guy was really fucking annoying and just kind of weird. The thing that I constantly remember is he kept talking about, like, I really want to say he used the term bar wenches when we stopped at the inn, and we were just like, dude, you have a weird fixation on this, and it's making everyone uncomfortable. Don't be that fucking guy in your tabletop role-playing game group, if I can give any advice, because it makes people like young Rosin not want to engage with the hobby anymore. You're just alienating people, and, like, I don't know, it's just weird. Don't do that. So it wasn't until many years later I would end up kind of considering tabletop role-playing games again when a podcast that a bunch of friends and I listened to had a random, like, 2 episodes where they decided to play Dungeon World because, like me and a lot of my internet friends, they were fairly inexperienced with tabletop role-playing games, and they kind of wanted to see what the deal was, so they got someone they knew to GM a game of Dungeon World, which was definitely very popular at the time in the indie game scene, and is a very accessible and approachable game. One I frankly do not feel comfortable recommending anymore to people, just because one of the creators behind it turned out to be the fucking creep who can't respect boundaries, and there was a whole controversy around Adam Koebel that just made me never really want to engage with Dungeon World as a system anymore. So, that was awkward, but back then, there was no controversy in sight, and I remember listening to this podcast, and a few of my other friends who also listened to that podcast thought, like, wow, this is pretty neat. And a little bit after that, like, I want to say a few months after, we considered playing tabletop role-playing games ourselves, like, just over Skype. This was around the time where, like, Roll20 was a thing. Like I talked about in my last thing, like, virtual tabletops definitely had a presence at this point in the medium's history, so we just all got to talking, and we were like, yeah, this would be really fun to do. The only problem is that all of us were, like, completely inexperienced at this, except for, like, maybe a random time playing a game here or there, but none of us really knew what we were doing. And I latched onto this, and I was like, I really think I want to do this, and I'm kind of impressed I did, because, with how many negative experiences I had, or not even negative, but just, like, the first one was, like, kind of, like, lukewarm, mediocre, just, like, a half-forgotten childhood memory, and then the other one was, like, a just kind of weird experience with a creepy player that almost made me just not want to engage with the whole thing. I don't know why, but there's just a part of me that was like, this seems really fun, and I feel like we could have a lot of fun with this as a group of friends. So what I ended up doing is I did a lot of research, just trying to figure out, like, hey, what should we play? What should we do? What's the best way to go about this? And I remember finding a forum post that was, like, from, like, the mid-2000s or something, that someone had basically a similar situation to mine, where they had a bunch of friends, including themselves, who wanted to get into it, but none of them had any experience. And one of the replies in that thread that really changed something in my brain was someone saying, hey, when the hobby started, no one else knew how to GM either. Someone had to take the dive and be the person to GM first in their group, you know? Like, no one knew what this was like back in the day. We all kind of made it up as we went along and learned from each other and kind of figured out how things went just by taking a risk and playing. And, you know, if you have a bad time with it, you have a bad time with it, but at least you can say you tried or whatever. And I thought about that, I'm like, you know, that's right. Why don't I just fucking try it? So I looked up as many, like, advice columns and whatever tips and guides as I possibly could. Those things are a lot more prevalent now than they were back in, like, 2014, I want to say. And I decided that Dungeon World seemed like a pretty cool system to run. It was a very, very brief and simple system to run. It was also free, which helped a lot, or at least a good portion of it was free. I think I ended up buying it later just so we could play with the extra stuff that the paid version had. I forget how that game was laid out, but if I recall, most of what you needed to play Dungeon World could be gotten just through the website. And if you wanted to pay to get, like, the full version, you could do that whenever you felt ready to play with the full version. And it was a super fun time. It was super chill, laid back, and successful. I remember my first party of players was like 3 people. I barely remember even what the situation was, but I do vaguely remember something about fooling a group of bandits by everyone hiding in a tree and then shaking the branches and pretending that they were a group of tree gods or something, and, like, they kept rolling fantastically on their, like, you know, rolls or, like, their moves to do that, and they, like, completely surpassed the encounter I had laid out, which I thought was fascinating, because, you know, being amateur GM, I was like, oh, they're gonna fight the bandits or whatever, but, you know, one of the things that GMing teaches you is you should make no assumptions about how your players are going to handle situations that you put in front of them. So that was really cool to see, and that was definitely, I think, the first spark moment I had where I went, oh, this is fucking cool. I like this a lot. From there, my friends and I expanded it to an even bigger group of players, and we played a game of Dungeon World. Again, that was a more fleshed out homebrew setting that we all kind of... I say we all kind of built together. What really happened is I planned out most of it, and every now and again I'd ask people what they wanted to name a town or a location or something, but it was mostly me doing my world-building thing, which is actually something else that really drew me to GMing. As someone who has attempted to write stories for a huge portion of my life and just never really felt the need to follow through or really finish them, I got really into GMing as a way to exercise my world-building desires, and that drive I have within me to make cool fantasy worlds and just interesting settings, really. It was a really great outlet for something that I'd been frustrated with for much of my life for not really being able to have an outlet for, because you know, it's just hard for me to stick to writing. You know, writing books or writing stories is hard work. Actually started getting to a fantasy novel during November for NaNoWriMo, but I didn't really stick with it. But I have that rough draft there, and I have a prologue done whenever I want to get back to it, I suppose. But yeah, the Dungeon World campaign, I guess we'll call it the second Dungeon World campaign I did, was really cool. The first player character I ever killed off was when one of our melee-oriented characters decided to go into a boss encounter with a cursed katana that kind of worked kind of like the sword from the Elric book, Stormbringer. If it killed someone, it would like suck the soul out of the person and then trap them in the katana. And somehow or other, the that swordsman got hypnotized and killed. I want to say it was like the party cleric or whatever, and we were all like, "Oh, that's fucked up." But like, there's a really interesting narrative hook, and it like completely transformed that character's personal arc, and made them kind of a darker, more brooding and like sorrowful character that was just really interesting to see. I think that might have been one of the moments where I realized like, oh hey, this is a cool thing that you could tell serious stories with. Because other than that, the campaigns were a little cringy and a little jokey in ways that, you know, they're full of stupid memes and stuff like that. Like, we kept putting Sonic references into that second campaign, I remember. Like, I think one of my I think it was that cleric decided that their patron god was like a blue hedgehog, and every time that they asked for like a divine sign to figure out where they should go, like a trail of Sonic rings would like illuminate their path or something like that. We also had the Chaos Emeralds as part of the plot. It was just a goofy time, but that one character death I think really hammered home to me, and even the players I was playing with, like, oh, you can just like the act of playing these games and following their rules and naturally seeing what comes out of them and the interactions that these systems encourage can lead to really deep and moving and compelling story beats. So that was cool. We eventually wrapped up our Dungeon World campaign, and then we took a little break for a bit. We felt the itch to go back, and we started playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, which was, again, at the time, big hot buzz. And it was definitely kind of hard to learn, just because it is a much more complex game, and frankly, in a way, I don't think D&D 5e is actually very good at teaching people how to play tabletop role-playing games. I think the community did a lot of the legwork on that. Frankly, I think just trying to learn from the books themselves, it is very daunting, and I don't think it sets people up, or I don't think it sets groups up to have the best time with it. And I know that certainly for the first few sessions we did not. It was very rough and awkward as we tried to figure out how it was supposed to be played. But it was in the same setting as our Dungeon World campaign, but like 100 years later with a completely new cast of characters with like some echoes of the old campaign. We ran through a few character arcs. I remember I had a player who their character hook was that they were in debt to a university because they went to like magician school or something. But just like real life, they were just hammered with student debt, and they were trying to evade their like debt collectors or whatever. And that story arc accumulated with them going to like the flying island that their mage school was on and like crashing it into the ground or something ridiculous like that. It was a very cool moment I remember from that campaign, but I don't remember much else, honestly, from that initial D&D 5th edition game. It did get to a point where I was like, hey, I kind of want to try playing, because I haven't done that in years at that point, and I never really felt like I had a chance to try playing in a game where I really liked it or had a good time or trusted the GM to know what they were doing, or, you know, make sure everyone was having a good time. So one of my friends decided that he wanted to attempt to try running the game. And we decided to wrap up the arc that we were on and create a new story arc that never ended up getting finished, but it was fun while it lasted, where he ran us through a fun little situation involving, I think it was like mysterious supernatural entities that were causing like a unnatural winter in a town that normally it doesn't snow or something to that effect. But I decided to make a character to join our party, and it was a halfling warlock named Isaac. And Isaac's gimmick was that he was the D&D equivalent to the guy who they call in at Pawn Stars, who is like really hyper specifically specialized in a specific like area of identification or evaluation of objects. And I think this all started because I made that warlock and gave him the identify spell, and we were talking, I was like, it'd be really funny if like that identify spell was basically his career. Like he was just the guy who identified things and determined their value or if they were magic or not. And we actually introduced the character by having the party go sell a magical like artifact or something they found at a shop in this shitty little town. And the guy was like, "Oh, I don't know about this. Let me call in a guy that knows about magical like horse statues or something ridiculous like that." And then my character enters, and then realized that something happened where it turned out like my character realized he had a good reason to be adventuring with this party, so he joined up with them or whatever. It was a really fun time. I remember having a blast playing as that character. I wouldn't mind bringing that character back, maybe workshopping him to work in other systems or give him another go at some point too, because he was a lot of fun to play as. But I do remember from there our campaign just kind of came to a halt. I think people just got busy with stuff, we're all in university, or at least most of us were at that point. And it was just kind of hard to get together with any regularity around schedules and stuff like that. From there, I would try out different like indie games and things with like different groups of friends. A lot of them were like Powered by the Apocalypse stuff. Sometimes I'd actually I know for a fact I have never actually played in a Powered by the Apocalypse campaign. It's always something I've wanted to do. I've only ever ran PBTA, but every now and again I would play in a game or like a one-shot or something of like a random system. And sometimes I'd run stuff. Like I remember I would run some Dungeon World one-shots with my channel Discord when that was still a thing. There was actually a point where I put together a West Marches style campaign, if you know what that is. Basically, it's a big sandbox style campaign where you have a bunch of different goals or jobs in the world kind of that you can set up. And it's kind of on the onus of the players, of which there are many, to gather into groups and explore the world and make progress through the world. It's a very cool sort of like crawl through the world and see what wonders it has sort of adventure type that I actually had a lot of fun with, though again I got busy and that kind of fell off from that. Though I do remember the last session of that we did do, I remember because I wanted it to be like a big hook for the world of like, oh, this is a big threat in the world that people need to be careful of. And it involved a dragon attacking a town, and I was originally like kind of intending like, oh, the party's probably not going to want to fight this dragon. They're probably going to run away or try to save people while the dragon's attacking, and whatever. I created it more of like a set piece rather than like an actual like enemy encounter, if that makes sense. But again, you know what I said earlier about making assumptions about what your players are going to do. I just remember everyone's like, no, we're going to fucking fight this thing. We're going to die trying to protect this town. And like, they barely made it out with like everyone okay. I remember like they actually killed the dragon, but like it took them everything. And I just remember thinking like, oh my God, this is so fucking cool. Like, against all odds, like even like statistically within the system, I just remember being like, I don't really think they can pull this off, and like then they did, and I was like, oh wow, that was actual like heroism right there. And I remember that was the last session we really left off on. Shout outs to anyone listening to this who was part of the old West Marches game in the Discord. Those were such a blast to do. I wouldn't mind doing a West Marches style thing again at some point in my life, but they are kind of a pain in the ass to run, not gonna lie. Or not run, I guess run, but really the prep is the problem, because you really need to build out a lot of that world and make sure it's connected in interesting ways, and give people incentive to explore it in a way that you don't need to do as much of in a regular campaign, where you can kind of feel out what areas are going to be relevant and you should kind of put more of your prep time for. It really feels like you're designing like a true open world sandbox when you do West Marches, because that's really what that whole style of play is based on. So Yeah, from there, over time, I kind of became disillusioned with D&D as a whole, not just 5e, and to an extent kind of D20 systems, because they are very oriented around dungeon crawling and combat in a way that, like, I get why it's appealing, I get why they're popular, but I've just found, looking through indie role-playing games, and even just other role-playing game systems in general, I feel like there is so much you can do with tabletop RPGs as a medium that I feel like just leaving them as combat-centric, like, hex crawls can be somewhat limiting. Like, you know, if that's the type of game you want to run, more power to you. But even then, I feel like there's a lot better games to do that with than D&D. Like, recently, I guess not recently, it's been like probably like a year or so at this point, but I accepted an invite to play Pathfinder, which is being run by my friend Claire. That's been a wonderful time, and that kind of was the nail in the coffin for me for going, like, yeah, like, this is just way better at doing what D&D does than what D&D does. It doesn't help that I kind of think that Wizards of the Coast is just kind of a sketchy or scummy company in general, that I don't really care for supporting all that much, frankly. God knows they fucked up how many different times with different things, and screwed over creators and all sorts of nonsense, but I find myself more drawn to alternative systems that are, frankly, a lot of modern indie stuff really appeals to me, but even beyond that, like, running just other things that acknowledge that combat is just one possible way to deal with encounters, or something that is an option but is not the primary option. Something that's a little more universal, I guess, if that makes sense, appeals to me more. I know some people find this really boring, but the rare times where you get those tabletop role-playing game sessions where, like, everyone just talks things out, or it's a lot of, like, dramatic tension building or, like, narrative building, absolutely here for that shit. I absolutely adore that stuff. I am also the same type of person who, when playing Western RPGs, wants to be able to make characters who can do minimal fighting and can just use social pressure or social prowess to just talk their way out of things. I always find that really fun in video games and stuff, too. But, yeah, in recent years, I've really been keen on exploring many different types of systems, and it's been very fun, and I feel like it's made me a much better game master than I used to be, too. One thing, there was a lull there for a while, but one thing that really got me back into the hobby in full force was one of my friends referenced, like, we should get back to tabletop role-playing games someday or whatever, and one of them mentioned, like, oh, maybe we could do, like, a mecha thing, and I don't remember, there was a reason they referenced that, but I was like, you literally just asked, like, something I've always dreamed of doing, like, let's make this happen, we're gonna make this happen. My friends were like, oh, okay. We ended up playing a campaign of Beam Saber that actually we had so many players for that what we ended up doing is I ended up splitting them into two groups of mech mercenaries that both existed in the same setting but working for different factions. And the narrative that we built based off of that story was so fucking cool, and is definitely still to this day my absolute favorite campaign that I've ever run for. It was this group of mercenaries that all kind of came from impoverished and, like, troubled backgrounds, and then a group of, like, basically, like, fallen nobles, or, like, trust fund kids, or just, like, wealthy assholes that ended up somehow finding their way into a mecha mercenary group. And the juxtaposition between running 1 week, like, people who are just struggling to stay alive and can, like, barely make ends meet, living in a shitty apartment, or, like, a shitty, like, rented house or whatever, and then the other group that just lived in, like, a abandoned haunted mansion, because I thought that would be funny if they lived in a haunted mansion. It ended up being psychic aliens in the end and not ghosts. It's fine, it ended up working out, but it was just really cool to see 1 week this group struggling, and then the other week just, like, these wealthy asshole kids that were, like, making friends with, like, really influential assholes that were playing important parts in the war, And it was just this really powerful narrative, and it could be very funny at times too. Like they befriended these like really popular like influencers, who kind of served as some of their companions too. At some point there was a time skip. The groups kind of ended up merging into one as players had to drop off due to real life obligations and stuff, and then we had this really awesome final episode where we basically got everyone back together to have this really incredible battle where they basically defended Earth from this like weird psychic ghost remnant of a former antagonist, which was really fucking cool. A lot of wonderful moments in that campaign. I honestly will probably make videos talking about certain sessions or fun things we did, because that game of Beam Saber was just so out of this world. It lasted like 35 sessions, so like almost a full year. Or about a year if you consider like some weeks we just didn't play because people were busy or whatever, but really good time. And then nowadays, like I said, I'm playing in that Pathfinder game with Claire, which originally started when she attempted to run a 5th edition adventure. I think it was Princes of the Apocalypse it's called. And that ended up, we kind of fell off of that. In part because Claire was like, this is just kind of a pain in the ass to run, I'm not really having fun. Some of the players were also kind of like not super interested in playing D&D anymore. I frankly wasn't really interested in playing D&D anymore, but I was just like, this is a game everyone plays, so whatever. So then we moved over to Pathfinder 2nd edition, and then we had a total party kill, and then that was a reason to start a new campaign that we then are now currently playing in, which is interesting. All 3 of the characters I've made for Claire's campaigns I actually like a lot, and have considered like, ooh, maybe I'll like try to like redo or like play as that character again in like another campaign at some point or something. Just because I really like them. And in fact, some of them, like Raven and Amber and Epsilon, you can see in this video footage right here. All 3 of those are characters of mine from a, former Claire campaigns. Though actually, now that I'm looking at the screen, it looks like Epsilon isn't in the party anymore. At some point during my Wizardry playthrough, Epsilon sadly died. Tragic. He was a thief who was a mailman, but he was like a scam artist mailman who would like promise to deliver things, but then like steal the package or steal parts of the package, and that was kind of his grift. Good times. But then from there, so I'm playing, like I said, I'm playing in Claire's campaigns right now. I also am hosting, as you probably know if you're subscribed to me, a Blades in the Dark game that takes place in a custom setting called Daggers and Moonlight, and I really need to get back to uploading more of those. We finished the first arc of that, and then we're going to do some fun like time skip stuff with that as well. And then have a second season of that at some point. But I have this whole season recorded of stuff, and I just need to take the time to actually edit it and put in background music. I decided that the aesthetic of that actual play series was going to be like, I kind of want to fill this with like PS1 music for whatever reason. And I'm trying to stick to that as best as I possibly can, and I feel like it really gives it a nice, cohesive, like, sense of identity and like a nice atmospheric mood that I want to go for. So yeah, check out Daggers and Moonlight if you haven't yet already. I am very proud of the work me and my friends have done, telling a story of very, very morally compromised people trying to make it in a shitty city that is surrounded by a weird ghost fog. It is a very fun time. Just in general, I'd say that Blades in the Dark and the general Forged in the Dark system is possibly I'd say without a doubt it's my favorite role-playing game system that I've ever interacted with. Just the way it handles narrative tension through the use of clocks and things like that, or even like stress mechanics or heat. I love all of that shit so much. It just taps all of the right things in my brain. In terms of what I like in stories and heightening dramatic tension and stuff like that. It's a great time. But yeah, actually in a few more days, like 3 days from now, I'm also going to be game mastering Fellowship 2nd Edition for the first time, which I'm really looking forward to. For those of you who don't know, Fellowship is another Powered by the Apocalypse style game, kind of in the vein of Dungeon World, but not really. In fact, I think I've even... I follow the author now on Twitter, and I believe she said that she's kind of planning like a 3rd edition where she's gonna make it so separate from Powered by the Apocalypse it probably couldn't even be like considered that anymore or something. But it, it's kind of in that lineage of RPGs. But the main gimmick behind Fellowship is that you have all of your different players who play as different representatives or champions of different people, like, things like orcs or exiles or elves or different like fantasy races possibly, but also just like different cultures within those broader groups and stuff like that. And all of the players have final say on the world building for their respective people. So it's kind of this like collaborative world building exercise, as well as playing a fantasy game. And then the GM isn't just the GM. The GM actually takes the role of an evil overlord that's kind of supposed to be like Sauron in the setting, where just making the world a horrible place and has all these different plans that they're trying to do while the party tries to wrest control away of the evil overlord's like sources of power, such as like magical artifacts or things that help make them powerful, and try to uncover what the overlord's weaknesses are and stuff like that. It seems like a really cool system. I really enjoy the idea of the GM having their own character and kind of having rules and limitations about what they can throw at the players or kind of what they're doing. That seems very cool to me. So I'm very excited to play that come Saturday, and I'll probably report back about how that's gone. But yeah, we have gone for almost 50 minutes now, and I figured this is probably a good place to wrap it up. So, too long didn't read, had some awkward experiences with D&D when I was younger, ended up getting into the hobby via Dungeon World and D&D 5th edition with my online friends later on in my life, and yeah, since then I've kind of become somewhat anti-D&D, I'd say, and just think that the tabletop role-playing game medium just has so many cool different systems and stuff to play around with, and I think part of it too is just like, I cannot think of another creative medium that has as bad of a monopoly as D&D has on tabletop role-playing games. It's really bad. I know there are people that are like, oh, like the MCU took over movies, but like, that's bad enough, but like unironically, I think it is a travesty how much of the air D&D steals away from other works in the TRPG scene, and again, I have no qualms about playing D&D or running D&D or having anyone choose that over other games if that's what they feel like they want to play or whatever. I get it, trust me, it's I've been there, but I just think that there's so many cool things that you can do with the hobby that D&D doesn't really allow you to do. And there's so many interesting systems to play that, I feel like a kid in a candy store anytime I look at itch.io or Drive Through RPG or whatever, and I'm just like, there's all this cool shit out there for you to experience. Why would you ever want to limit yourself to just one thing, There's so many wonderful different angles you can take to running games and experiences you can craft for your players just beyond like what D20 games allow you to do, and I just want to experience all of it if I can, so I've been having a great time with that. But yeah, I guess in the future I will try to make more of these videos, at least semi-regularly. I'll probably get back to you after a few sessions of Fellowship to talk about my impressions of it, maybe talk a little bit about stories from that old Beam Saber game, or even maybe talking a little bit about prepping for things, or why I like to GM, or God knows what we can do with the series. The world is my oyster, as they say. So yeah, I really hope you had a good time listening to this, and if you somehow made it all the way to the end of this and you're like, I don't know if tabletop role-playing games are for me, I've never really tried them, or I'm interested or whatever, like, I'd say take the plunge. It can be kind of intimidating at first, I get it, and it's, especially if you're like socially anxious or something, kind of like I am, I understand, like, there's kind of that fear there, like, oh, I'm gonna be cringy, or it's gonna be awkward, or we're not gonna know what to do, or it's not gonna be fun, or just do it, you know? Look up examples of people playing games you want to play, look up advice videos or articles or whatever, there's a million out there, forum posts, Reddit posts, whatever. Whatever you need advice on, there's crap out there to help you run games. And just take the plunge, you won't regret it. It's just such a blast, and I can't wait to further share more of my love of this hobby with all of you. So, thanks for listening, and see you later. Have a good one. Good night.